There is a very specific pattern that authoritarian leaders use when they are losing control of the narrative. They declare victory before any victory has actually happened. It's an old technique, a magician's trick, and what we're seeing right now with Trump is nothing new. But the setting in which he's applying this trick is the most dangerous we've ever seen. Because this time, it's not an election. It's not a press conference about the economy. We're talking about a real war, with real missiles, with real civilians dying. And while the world literally holds its breath over what might happen in the Middle East, the President of the United States is standing at a podium telling everyone he's already won within the first hour. Jen Psaki, who knows from the inside how the White House works, was furious. Let's look at what she said and what I have to add about all of this.
I mean, he has repeatedly made completely contradictory statements about his plans for this war and how long it will be. And every time he is asked which of his diametrically opposing statements is actually U.S. policy, he just shrugs his shoulders and says it's both.
You've said the war is, quote, very complete, but your defense secretary says this is just the beginning. So which is it, and how long should Americans be prepared?
Well, I think you could say it both.
For? You just said it is a little excursion, and you said it is a war. So which one is it?
Well, it's both. It's both.
It literally cannot be both, but it's always both, even though it logically cannot be. And this just keeps happening. I mean, every day we get a news statement that contradicts the last thing they said. For example, here was Secretary Hegseth during an interview with 60 Minutes on Sunday.
Well, we're not flying a mission accomplished banner like George W. Bush on an aircraft carrier. We're not doing that, and we haven't done that.
Okay, no mission accomplished banner for us. We're not doing that. We haven't done that. Well, Donald Trump didn't have a banner at his rally today in Kentucky, but he did say this.
Well, it's only good if you win. You know, you can only do. And we've won. Let me say, we've won. You know, you never like to say too early you won. We won. We won the bet. In the first hour, it was over.
Does it feel like we've won? Trump says we won. It was over in the first hour. That sounds pretty mission accomplished to me. All of this would be, well, concerning because he's the leader of the free world. Some of it is funny if the consequences weren't deadly serious. And I've thought about this all day today and who I really wanted to talk to today. I've talked to so many smart public officials who are doing everything they can to hold this administration accountable. We'll continue to do that. But tonight, I really want to spend some time with people who I have actually sat with in the Situation Room and who I know have spent hours in these rooms to just really help unpack everything that is happening and not hold back in any way. Michael McFaul is the former U.S. ambassador to Russia during the Obama administration. Ben Rhodes was Deputy National Security Advisor to President Obama. There's always so much to say each of these days, of these last 12 days, that we have all been covering and talking about this war. And I'm going to try to get to all of it, but I hope you will bring up things that have struck out to you, too. But Ben, just a couple of hours after Donald Trump said we won, we got some breaking news from Reuters. 3 sources familiar with the matter tell Reuters that U.S. intelligence indicates that Iran's leadership is still largely intact and is not at risk of collapse anytime soon. And this is just yet another one of these reports that we see every day where I think back to all of the hours you both, I spent some time in them, but you spent more time in them, spent in contingency meetings to discuss what would happen if you did things like struck Iran. And I just wonder, with that news and just everything you're seeing, kind of how you assess where we are at this moment.
I think where we are, Jen, is that Donald Trump wants this to play out like on his own terms, on his own timelines. And that's not at all what's happening in Iran. It's not what's happening in the region, and it's not what's happening around the world. And all of what's happening is predictable. I did sit in contingency meetings about this exact scenario, a war with Iran, over a decade ago, and all of these things would happen. So first of all, the Iranian regime is not one man. It's not the 86-year-old supreme leader. It is a deep and ideological machinery that cannot be destroyed in 2 or 3 or 4 weeks of airstrikes. Full stop. The most heavily armed, there are millions of people under arms in the Iranian system. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, is the most powerful force inside of Iran. They're the ones that are going to emerge in any kind of power vacuum. They have. They're the ones who are backing Ali Khamenei's son as the new supreme leader. They're not going to give up power. They're just not. And maybe Iran will fracture into some civil war, but they'll be fighting in that civil war. You've now had the war spread to over 10 countries in the region. Lebanon has nearly 1 million people displaced because of the Israeli bombardment there. Israelis are in bomb shelters. The Gulf has been devastated by strikes against not just military but civilian targets as well. The oil is not flowing through the Straits of Hormuz. 20% of the world's energy goes through there. So that's a global problem. Americans have spent over $10 billion. The economic cost to the world is probably tens and tens, if not over $100 billion. Donald Trump does not control these things. Israel has a vote. The Iranians have a vote. What other actors in the region do have a vote. So this thing is way beyond his control, and they're not going to achieve their objectives of replacing the Iranian regime or getting unconditional surrender. That's not going to happen in a 2 or 3 week air campaign.
As I just said, it seems like he thinks he can just shout things out and the world's going to follow. And that's not how things work. It's not how war works, not how anything works.
What strikes me most about this entire episode is not the contradiction itself, because contradiction has become almost background noise when Trump speaks. What strikes me is the timing and the target of these contradictions, because there is a fundamental difference between a politician who changes his position on fiscal policy or immigration and a commander-in-chief who cannot define in a single press conference whether the country is or is not at war. This is not strategic ambiguity. This is the absence of doctrine. And here's the point that I think needs to be stated more forcefully. Real strategic ambiguity, the kind the United States wielded with mastery for decades, is a deliberate, calculated tool. You don't tell the enemy exactly what you're going to do in order to preserve tactical options, but it works in a context where your allies understand what you're doing. What Trump does is the opposite of that. He confuses the enemy, yes, but he also confuses Congress, NATO allies, Gulf partners, and the American people themselves. That is not strategy. That is unmanaged chaos masquerading as strategy. There is another element that needs to be put on the table, the domestic political economy of this conflict. Trump has a serious problem. He spent years promising he would end wars, that he would bring the troops home, that the Democrats were the warmongers, and now he is managing a large-scale military operation in the Middle East. So he needs to simultaneously appear strong enough to justify the action, but also appear as though it's already over, that it was quick, that it was clean, that it was a victory. It's an equation impossible to solve in reality, so he solves it in the narrative. He declares victory because he needs the political win, regardless of what is actually happening on the ground. The problem is that Iran did not read his script. The IRGC, which is essentially a state within the Iranian state, with its own economy, its own social base, its own internal loyalties, is not simply going to dissolve because Washington declared mission accomplished. This is one of the most recurring mistakes in American foreign policy over the last few decades. The belief that air superiority automatically translates into political transformation. It does not. Afghanistan lasted 20 years. Iraq is still not over. And Iran is a far more complex, far more deeply rooted system than either of those two. And there is a dimension I want to highlight because it rarely appears in this debate with the depth it deserves. The cost to America's moral credibility has concrete, measurable effects on geopolitics. When the United States publicly dismisses civilian deaths, especially when the president says he doesn't know about an attack on a school, countries in the global south take note. These countries have long memories. China takes note. Russia takes note. Every time the U.S. applies a double standard, condemning the atrocities of adversaries while minimizing its own, it loses ground in the competition for global influence. And that competition in the 21st century is as much about narrative as it is about military power. What Jen Psaki understands, having lived it from the inside, is that the White House is a communications machine in constant operation. And when that machine sends contradictory signals, the cost is not merely reputational. The cost is operational. Allies don't know how to position themselves. Diplomats don't know what to negotiate. Military personnel in the field don't know what the final objective is. And that vacuum of clarity in an active conflict zone can cost lives. If this content made you think, share it with someone who needs to understand what is really happening, because disinformation in wartime is not merely inconvenient, it is dangerous.